Thank you. I don't know. 3 of the most beautiful words in the English language. 3 words that would have saved me $700 if my daughter had said them at the right moment. Here's the backstory. The day before she got her driver's license, she was with me in the car, and we needed to fill up the tank. So I drove to the gas station, got out to fill up the tank, and she was in the passenger seat there pecking away on her phone. And I said to her, "Do you know how to fill up a tank?" And she's like, "Dad, I know," rolls her eyes at me and keeps going at the phone. I had a check in my gut about this, but part of parenting is picking your battles. Decided to let this one slide. Huge mistake. 24 hours later, after she got her driver's license, my phone rang. "Dad, the car won't start." Now, she was driving a 15-year-old Honda. Not the nicest car in the world, but still pretty reliable, so I figured there was some kind of rookie mistake going on here. She left the lights on, drained the battery, forgot to put the car into park, something like that. No. This girl had filled the car up with diesel. Do you realize that the diesel nozzle at the gas station is deliberately made too large to fit into the tank of a gasoline car? I don't even know how she did it. I told her, I said, "How did you put diesel in the car?" "Dad, I don't know." Now you don't know. Yesterday you said you knew how to fill up the car. Let me tell you something. The difference between wisdom and foolishness are those 3 little words. I don't know. The smartest people you know got that way because they were willing to admit, I don't know. The entire process of childhood, adolescence, and adulthood is a process of discovering all the things you don't know and being willing to admit it. That's what I want to talk to you about today. The reality is that when we are willing to admit our ignorance, we are on a path to growing. But if we think we already know everything, we will only remain in our ignorance. Let's begin on June 10th, 1752 in Philadelphia. That's the day that Benjamin Franklin flew his silk kite before that thunderstorm with the key attached to it. Franklin was an endlessly curious person, always willing to admit what he didn't know. And he didn't know much about electricity, so he spent time experimenting with it in his home. And he was able to create little sparks, little static electricity sparks with wool and metal. And he began to wonder why these little sparks looked like tiny bolts of lightning. And he speculated, well, what if lightning is nothing more than electricity? What if it's just static in the atmosphere? And to test his theory that day, he flew that silk kite, and sure enough, as the lightning storm was approaching, it picked up a charge, and the key, as the rain fell on it, started to actually spark. This led to one of the greatest discoveries and inventions of the 18th century, the lightning rod. You've probably never thought about this, but for centuries, churches burned to the ground more than any other buildings. Do you know why? Because in any given town or village, the church was the tallest structure, and lightning would strike the bell tower or the steeple all the time, often causing catastrophic fires. But Franklin, with his lightning rod, realized if you put this metal rod on the top of the building with wires down to the ground, you could safely conduct the electricity away from the building and save the structure and lives. An amazing invention. Just one problem. In the 1700s, there were Christians, both in Europe and in the colonies, that refused to believe Ben Franklin's view of electricity and lightning. You see, in their minds, they already completely understood how lightning worked. And in their minds, lightning was not static electricity in the atmosphere. No. Lightning was wrath from the finger of God against sinners. And Mr. Franklin, who was an outspoken non-Christian, and his lightning rods, they were interfering with the will of God. They were actually going to provoke God's wrath against us if we put lightning rods on top of our buildings. And so when lightning rods started going up, both in the colonies and in Europe, I kid you not, people rioted in the streets. They protested. They actually sued their neighbors when a neighbor would put a lightning rod up because they believed it was going to provoke God's wrath on the town. If you think masking divided churches, let me tell you something. The original lightning rod issue was literally lightning rods. Churches were divided over these things. If a church put a lightning rod on top of its building, in some places that was clear evidence that that congregation had turned away from God and rejected the gospel of Jesus Christ. We'll come back to the lightning rods later. But here's what I want you to get. Franklin, being willing to say, I don't know about lightning, opened himself up to curiosity. He was teachable, and it led to one of the greatest discoveries of the 18th century. Whereas others who thought they had it all figured out, who thought they completely understood this phenomenon, were closed-minded, unteachable, brittle in spirit, and it led to divisions and unnecessary catastrophes. This is what I want to talk to you about today. I look at the country, I look at the church in America right now, and I think that this may well be one of our greatest challenges. We live at a time of incredible diversity, a lot of challenges, a lot of differences of opinion and views that are filtering through our culture, and there are some voices in the church that are telling us that the way to navigate this moment is with certainty. To not give an inch about anything we think, any opinion we hold, any belief that we've ascribed to. We need to hold it with unwavering certainty. Every inch, don't give up. But is that really what we're called to in Christ? Or is it possible that our absolute certainty is only making us stupid? Could there be another way, a way of humility, teachability, that leads to new glories for the church in this age? Those are the themes that we're going to address looking at John chapter 9 today. If you have a copy of the scriptures, I want you to turn there. John chapter 9 is a fascinating chapter. I don't have time to read all of it, and we could honestly spend weeks and weeks and weeks unpacking all the beautiful things in this chapter. I'm going to highlight some things and take you through the story bit by bit, but it begins when Jesus' disciples encounter a blind man. And they ask Jesus, who sinned that this man was born blind, him or his parents? You see, the disciples thought they understood how blindness worked. They thought they had it all figured out, just like the Christians in the 18th century with lightning. Blindness was God's judgment upon someone's sin. The only question in their minds was whose sin? Was it the blind man himself or his parents that provoked God's anger that led to his condition? And Jesus says, you guys don't know what you're talking about. Look at verse 3. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so the works of God might be displayed in him. And then Jesus goes on to heal this blind man. Eventually, the town is all kind of stirred up about this. It's unheard of for someone to have their sight restored. There's not a single miracle in the Old Testament of somebody's sight being restored. This had to be the work of God, but they were confused by it. So they took the blind man to the smartest guys in town, the synagogue leaders, the religious leaders, to ask them, explain this to us. These men were also certain that they understood how the world worked. They understood how God worked. They understand the Old Testament, his commands. And so when they saw this blind man and they heard that Jesus had healed him on the Sabbath, and he did so by making mud with spit and dirt and putting on this, they said, wait a minute, God has clearly commanded us not to work on the Sabbath, but healing somebody and making mud, Jesus completely violated the Sabbath. And so look at verse 16. They said, this man, meaning Jesus, is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. And again, in verse 24, they say, we know that this man, Jesus, is a sinner. Their certainty is just dripping off the page. These guys were so smart, so educated, so certain that before they really investigated what happened, before they spoke to Jesus about what happened, before they began to rethink their theology or investigate the scriptures more carefully about the teachings of the Sabbath, before doing any of that, they had already made up their mind. They were certain Jesus was a sinner, case closed, end of story. On the other hand, you have the blind man, the man who was healed. Having been born blind, he was uneducated, unemployable. He was ignorant. He was not trained in theology and scriptures. He was at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. And yet, by the end of the chapter, verse 38, it's the blind man who says, Lord, I believe. and he worships Jesus. Our task today is to understand why. Why did certainty lead to the blindness of the religious leaders? And why did humility and uncertainty lead to the adoring worship of the blind man? And how are we going to choose the better path? First, let's begin with the certainty and blindness of the religious leaders. To do that, we need to go to San Francisco, December 21st, 1954. Dorothy Martin claimed that aliens had spoken to her and given her a vision of the future. And December 21st, 1954 was going to be the end of the world. The aliens told her that there was going to be a cataclysmic flood, the entire world was going to be destroyed. Dorothy Martin started a cult called the Seekers. And she told her followers that if you perfectly obey my commands, the aliens are going to come back and rescue us on their spacecraft. The rest of the world will be destroyed, but we will be saved. The Seekers ended up following Dorothy Martin's commands. They sold all of their property. They left their jobs. They left their homes. They isolated themselves out in the outskirts of town. I don't have to tell you that December 21st, 1954 was not the end of the world. There was no cataclysmic flood. And that caught the attention of a guy at Stanford University named Leon Festinger. Festinger wanted to understand how these cult members reacted to being proven wrong about their belief. So he spent hours and hours interviewing the Seekers. And what he found is absolutely amazing. What he discovered is a tiny fraction of these cult members were willing to admit that they were wrong. Only a handful were willing to say that, yeah, they had been duped by Dorothy Martin. Instead, the vast majority of these cult members refused to change their belief. And Festinger's like, the world didn't end. And they go, yeah, it didn't end. But the reason it didn't end is because we obeyed Dorothy Martin, the aliens decided to give us more time. Yeah, you're laughing. Leon Festinger, in his observations of this cult, ended up coining a term that I know you've heard before. The term is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is what happens when you hold a really strongly held belief or opinion, but then you encounter a fact which contradicts that belief or opinion. Cognitive dissonance makes us feel uncomfortable. It's noise in the brain. It's this tension that, I have this belief, but there's this thing out there that is telling me I'm wrong, and it's really hard to live with it. And that's what these cult members were encountering. They had the belief that the world was going to end December 21st, 1954, and it didn't. That's cognitive dissonance. And what Festinger showed is that for most of us, cognitive dissonance is absolutely and completely intolerable. We cannot live in a state of cognitive dissonance. We somehow have to reconcile our strongly held belief with this new fact. But what he also showed is that the vast majority of people will go to extraordinary lengths to not actually rethink their belief. And that's exactly what those cult members did. They didn't want to admit they were wrong. Instead, they go, oh, no. You see, we actually prevented the end of the world by obeying our cult leader. The same thing's true with us. We hold something strongly. We're certain because that certainty makes us feel so good, so comfortable, that even when we encounter facts that disagree with us, we won't change our beliefs. Let's go back to those lightning rods in the 18th century. In the decades that followed the invention of the lightning rod, there was a split, both in Europe and in the colonies. The anti-rodders convinced that lightning wasn't static electricity, it was the wrath of God against sinners, and how dare you interfere with God's will. But the pro-rodders pointed out a logical inconsistency with the anti-rodders' point of view. What they said to them was, well, wait a minute. If lightning is God's judgment against sinners, why is it it's always churches that get struck and burned down, and never the brothels and the bars? There it is, cognitive dissonance, strongly held belief, a fact that contradicts the belief. What are you going to do? Well, the anti-rodders, they had an answer. They weren't going to admit that, lightning must be static electricity in the atmosphere, or maybe lightning rods are a good idea. No, they weren't going to go there. What they said was, you know what? Sometimes God judges the world passively by simply allowing demonic forces to do their mischief, just like in the book of Job, where he allows the Satan to go and create problems for Job. And so they said it's not really God directly causing the lightning, it's thunder demons that are causing the lightning. And that's why it strikes churches. And then through whatever the equivalent was of Facebook in the 18th century, news began to spread throughout the Christian subculture that the best way to fight thunder demons was by ringing church bells. I hope you can begin to see the problem here. Their certainty meant they doubled down on stupidity. All throughout the colonies in Europe, as thunderstorms were approaching, people sent men up into the bell towers. Yeah, let's put guys way up high in the sky during a thunderstorm with a giant metal bell holding a wet rope. Great idea. In the decade after the invention of the lightning rod, over 400 churches were struck by lightning and burned in Germany, and over 100 bell ringers were electrocuted. In France, it was very similar. Just around Paris and its vicinity, 103 bell ringers were electrocuted between 1756 and 1786, the 3 decades after the invention of the lightning rod, to the point that the parliament in Paris had to pass a law banning bell ringing during thunderstorms. Certainty makes us stupid. And you see the same thing happening in John 9 with the religious leaders. They also were so certain that they were right that even when presented with logical inconsistencies in their own argument, when shown that maybe they didn't have it right, they refused to bend. Look at verse 13. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man, meaning Jesus, is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. They were confident that they interpreted Scripture right, confident they understood Sabbath law right, confident that Jesus was a sinner, but they also had their facts challenged. Back to verse 16. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, how can a sinner perform such a sign? There it is, cognitive dissonance. We are certain that we have this Jesus guy figured out, yet he's healing the blind, which we know only God can do. How do you reconcile that cognitive dissonance? Well, like the California cult members, like the anti-Rodders in the 18th century, these religious leaders went to extraordinary lengths to deny the facts, to reconcile their cognitive dissonance. I want you to pay attention here. They do 3 things to try to reconcile their cognitive dissonance. 3 things that we still see all the time today. Ready? Number 1, they deny the evidence. Look at verse 18. It says, they did not believe that the man had been born blind. It's a hoax. He wasn't really blind. There was no miracle. This whole thing is just fake news. We don't have to believe this. This is ridiculous. Of course our beliefs are consistent and our certainty is sure. We still do this all the time, don't we? We hold something really strongly and we're confronted with something that contradicts it and we go, no, that's fake. We don't have to believe that. Bury our heads in the sand. We don't have to believe it. Move on. Well, this deny the evidence thing doesn't work too long for the religious leaders because eventually this man's parents show up and they confirm, yes, that's our son. Yes, he was born blind. Ugh, now what? Number 2, when the facts can't be denied, you discredit the messenger. They attack the blind man. Look at verse 31. The blind man is speaking to them. He says, we know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man, meaning Jesus, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. To this they replied, the religious leaders replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? If you can't deny the facts, discredit the messenger. What they were saying is, hey, we are the smartest, most educated guys in Israel. You are an uneducated buffoon who was born blind, meaning you're a sinner, because we all know that people are blind because of sin. So why should we listen to you? They're trying to discredit the guy in front of the whole community, saying, I don't have to listen to anything you say because you are an idiot. Again, we see this all the time today. I don't have to listen to that. That's the New York Times. It's liberal bias. I don't have to listen to Fox News, MAGA, pro-Trump. Come on. You just dismiss any evidence you don't like, anything that contradicts what you firmly believe. It's an easy way to avoid cognitive dissonance. And then there's the third step. When you can't deny the evidence, when discrediting the messenger doesn't work, there's one final option before us: distance. Look at verse 34. It says that they cast the blind man out. This is technical language. What they actually did was they excommunicated him from the synagogue. Because the blind man wouldn't stop sharing his story, because that story was causing people to question the certainty of the religious leaders, they had to get rid of him. They had to kick him out. They had to silence him so that the cognitive dissonance wouldn't spread. And here's what I really want you to see. This is so important. The religious leaders didn't kick the man out because they were certain they were right. They kicked the man out because deep down, on some subterranean level, they feared they were wrong. They weren't protecting their certainty. What they were really protecting was the illusion of certainty. That comfort that comes from knowing I'm absolutely right all the time, and anyone who disagrees with me, kick them out. It's a sign of weakness, not strength. Leon Festinger said that we will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid what he called carriers of dissonance. Carriers can be people, carriers can be news sources, carriers can be whole communities. We will distance ourselves from anything that might cause me to doubt or question one of my firmly held views. This poses a significant problem for us as 21st century Americans. Here's why. We live in the most diverse, most disunified society that has ever existed in the history of the world. More racial diversity, more ethnic diversity, more religious diversity, more economic disparity and diversity, more political polarization than at any other time in the history of our country. What I'm saying is, we are surrounded every day by endless sources of cognitive dissonance. Every time you encounter a coworker, a neighbor, someone at school that thinks, votes, lives, believes differently than you do, you risk cognitive dissonance. Every time you turn on the TV or flip through the internet or see a social media channel coming through your feed that's presenting ideas or views that you don't like or disagree with or that challenge, you're encountering cognitive dissonance. And my great concern, honestly, for the church in America right now is that we are responding to this cognitive dissonance very much the way the religious leaders did in John 9. We deny, oh, that's fake news, I don't have to pay attention to that. We discredit, we don't have to listen to them, they're not real Americans, they're not true patriots. Oh, they're not real Christians, look at what they do at their church. Oh, we can dismiss them, I don't have to listen to that. And when those things don't work, we distance. We isolate ourselves into echo chambers where we only encounter media that reinforces what we want to hear rather than what we need to hear. We bring ourselves into homogenous communities and churches where everyone thinks like me and votes like me and views everything just like me, where I can always be comfortable and have that warm, fuzzy feeling of being certain all the time. Let me tell you, when we behave like that, we're not behaving like Jesus. We're behaving like the people who killed Jesus. It doesn't have to be this way. There is another option. And the part that worries me the most is, you know who's recognizing this tendency in the church? Our kids. Young adults, teenagers. They see when we behave like the religious leaders rather than Jesus. You gotta have a degree of sympathy, empathy for this generation, despite their poor driving skills. They're growing up in an incredibly complicated time. They're growing up surrounded in their young lives with constant cognitive dissonance, where they're being challenged about all the beliefs that their families and their churches and their culture has taught them. And so as they reach young adulthood, adolescence, they're full of questions. Questions about faith, questions about politics, questions about justice and race and sexuality and gender. They're bombarded by this stuff all the time. And if you think you can isolate them, if you think you can separate them from all the questions of the culture, good luck. The problem is our own children are now carriers of cognitive dissonance. But they're not out there in the culture. They're in our homes and they're in our churches. And as they reach young adulthood, they start bringing those questions and those doubts into our communities and into our churches. And sadly, we respond to those young people the way many of the religious leaders responded to the blind man in John 9. We cast them out. Not overtly, we don't literally kick them out the way they did this guy in John 9, but we send our signals. Subtly, we communicate, that question's not welcomed here. That view of politics or the culture or this issue, don't say that here. We're not into that here. Don't ask that here. Because it makes me uncomfortable. Because you are causing me to question what I think, and that's not all right. I want to be comfortable. Darn it, I come to church to be comfortable. Don't challenge me. And so sooner or later, these young people figure out, oh, I get it. You're the Pharisees. You're not Jesus. And they leave. Almost every week, there's another study coming out saying how many young people are leaving the faith. I think it was a week or two ago, Gallup or Pew came out showing that the number of people in our country who no longer believe in God is accelerating at a rate unprecedented in American history, most of them coming from church backgrounds. Why? There's a different explanation every week, too. Well, it's politics, or it's the changing sexual mores, or whatever it might be, and there's truth to all that, but I don't think a lot of these studies are getting down to the real foundational issue, which I think is cognitive dissonance. It's young people who are full of questions and doubts that are not welcomed by their faith community. And so they leave. And it's not welcomed by the faith community because we would rather be comfortable in our certainty than welcome carriers of dissonance. It doesn't have to be this way. We would rather live in the illusion of certainty than in the open embrace of those we disagree with. The problem with the illusion of certainty is sooner or later, all illusions are shattered. Brescia, Italy, August 18th, 1769. Almost 20 years after the invention of the lightning rod, the church in Brescia, San Nazaro, still refused to put a lightning rod on top of its building, believing that their bishops and their bells were enough to keep the lightning and thunder away. In fact, they were so certain of their belief and their understanding of lightning that the town leaders decided to put 200,000 pounds of gunpowder in the vault of the church, believing it to be the safest place in town. But that day, a lightning bolt hit the church and it exploded catastrophically, destroying a third of the town and an estimated 3,000 lives. Certainty not only makes us stupid, it can lead to catastrophic failure. This is my concern for the church today. Feeling threatened by the plurality of our society, the the diversity, all the new ideas, all the new people, all the new cultures, all the new religions. So many Christians are being told that certainty about everything is our only hope. But is it? Or are we just accelerating the destruction of the church? We don't have to be like the religious leaders in John 9. We have another option. We can be like the blind man. Notice that on numerous occasions in this chapter, and I do hope you go back and read through the whole chapter later today when you have some time alone, even before bed. Just meditate on the beauty of this chapter. But twice, in verse 12 and in verse 25, when the blind man is being questioned about Jesus and all the things that happened to him, twice he humbly and simply says those three beautiful words: I don't know. Three words that the religious leaders would never utter. Three words that led Benjamin Franklin on a journey of discovery that led to one of the best inventions of the 18th century. Three words that if my daughter had spoken, I would still have $700 and she wouldn't have gotten the nickname Diesel for the rest of high school. Three words that can open us to humility, teachability, to learn and discover. Three words that led this blind man to eventually a place where he would fall on his knees before Jesus and say, I believe, and humbly worship him. Here's the second way we can break the illusion of certainty, and this is important. We need to learn to distinguish between God and our ideas about God. Those are not the same thing. Let me explain. Certainty, strictly speaking, is not always wrong. It depends on the kind of certainty or what we put our certainty in. You see, the religious leaders had this sinful, prideful kind of certainty because their certainty was in their interpretation of Scripture. Their certainty was in their traditions. Their certainty was in their ideas and their education about who God was. That's what got them in so much trouble. But strictly speaking, the blind man also had some certainty, but not the sinful kind. Look at verse 25. The blind man is speaking, and he says, whether he, that's Jesus, whether Jesus is a sinner, I don't know. There it is, that beautiful humility. I don't know. One thing I do know, here's his certainty. One thing I do know, though I was blind, now I see. His certainty was not in his ideas about Jesus. His certainty was in his experience with Jesus. This makes all the difference in the world. We can go out there and parade around the culture and say, we know this and we know that, and we're right on this thing and we're right on that thing and you're wrong. And the culture's going to go, really? Our kids are going to say, are you kidding me? Instead, what if we built our certainty on our communion with God, in prayer, in deep communion with him, in our experience with him, and say, you know what, I'm not so sure about that idea. I have other thoughts on it, but here's what I do know. I know the love of God. I know his power in my life. I know he loves you too. In the New Testament, we're told that truth is not an idea, it's not a doctrine, it's a person. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Finally, we can break this illusion of certainty by remaining in diverse communities. Communities, frankly, that are filled with cognitive dissonance. The first church in the first century, it was just boiling over with cognitive dissonance. Jews and Gentiles, freed people and the enslaved, rich and poor, men and women, all of society around one table, calling each other sisters and brothers. The world thought they were nuts. Even Jesus' 12 apostles were riddled with dissonance. There was Simon the Zealot, a freedom fighter, a patriot who believed in using violence, and Matthew the tax collector, a globalist who believed in cooperating with his enemies to make money. They were called into the same community. That's cognitive dissonance. When we are in community with people that are different than us, when we hear from each other, when they vote differently, when they think differently, when they live differently, it brings humility to the church. Frankly, rooms like this are what give me hope. Churches like this that embrace that diversity, that discomfort, and leaders like the leaders you have who are willing to say the hard things and challenge us rather than just say what we want to hear. It's communities like this where the ways of the world and the certainties of the world come to die and new things of God's kingdom are born. Speaking of death and rebirth, that church in Italy, San Nazaro, that was destroyed in the explosion from the lightning bolt, eventually they rebuilt the town, they rebuilt the church. It's still there today. And at the top of the pediment, the point of the church, is a beautiful, huge marble statue of Jesus with a halo around his head. But the halo, it's not marble, it's metal. And the radiating glory out of the halo, they're not just beams of glory, they're also lightning rods. That statue is a reminder that the true glory of the church is not found in our absolute certainty. It's not in our power and strength in the culture. It's from our humility, from our teachability, from our repentance. The true glory of the church comes the way it came for Jesus, by surrendering power and being willing to be humiliated and broken in front of the world. If we are to thrive in this new age, this diverse time in our society, it's not going to be by bludgeoning the people around us with what we think is right, but by welcoming people around us who carry dissonance with their questions and doubts and reminding them that you too are welcomed and loved by Christ. The glory of the church is not in our power or strength or certainty or not giving an inch. The glory of the church comes when, like that blind man, we can say humbly 3 simple words: I don't know. Because only after we say those 3 can our true testimony go forth. This I do know. I was blind, but now I see.